let's protect ourselves with swords like Jesus instructed us to do. Jesus was trying to appear like he was part of a rebellious group. I hope that I have spoken correctly. Luke chapter 22, verse 36 through 37 is an infamous verse. But now, he said, take your money and a traveler's bag, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. For the time has come for this prophecy about me to be fulfilled. He was counted among the rebels. Yes, everything written about me by the prophets will come true. I've been thinking about this verse for a long time now, and I even mentioned it in one of my most recent videos. Now, Mike Winger has recently released a video, and he discusses it as well. Mike has a series of episodes called 10 Questions with Mike Winger, and on his most recent one, episode 14, he discusses this verse. 17 minutes and 20 seconds into the video, he essentially gives his idea of what the verse is ultimately talking about, one of two things.
This seems like we got two options that I see that are viable in my opinion. You have self-defense, or you have the appearance of power as a deterrent. Those are the two options that I think are viable for this, and either option could work. You'd have to bring in other texts of scripture to try to give a stronger case for self-defense or just the appearance, but it's got to be minimally wearing weapons as a way of deterring people attacking you, or maximally arming yourself to actually defend yourself against unjust attacks. That's a challenging one, I admit, because the disciples do not defend themselves against unjust attacks in the book of Acts. They don't. Now you might say, well, in some situations we don't, but maybe in certain situations we can. I'm open to that. But certainly in most situations we see persecution related. They don't defend themselves at all. Stephen doesn't defend himself. Peter doesn't defend himself.
Then we should move on to where Jesus is praying at the Mount of Olives. He walked away about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine. From this verse, we do understand what Jesus' motive is. His motive is he wants his Father's will to be done. Ultimately, he doesn't want to have to suffer. Nobody would want to suffer, but he wants to do his Father's will, and he is more than willing to do so. So that gives us an understanding of Jesus' motive, so we can better understand 36 through 37. He knows he is eventually going to be crucified. He's going to be unjustly arrested and unjustly found guilty. Now, let's move on to Jesus being arrested and betrayed. Starting at verse 49, when the other disciples saw what was about to happen, they exclaimed, Lord, should we fight? We brought the swords. And one of them struck at the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear. And it later comes out that this is Peter. But Jesus said no more of this, and he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus spoke to the leading priests, the captains of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him. Am I some dangerous revolutionary, he asked, that you come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Originally, in a video that I did that's called Does Jesus Permit Self-Defense? I said this. In order for Jesus to be convicted and actually seen as a rebel, he or his disciples would have to have some kind of weapon on them. This would make Jesus look guilty in the eyes of Roman law. And I believe now that I was actually wrong when I said this, because I don't believe it is actually the case that Jesus was trying to appear like he was part of a rebellious group. And Mike Winger also makes this point. I'll play the clip for you.
When he says it must be fulfilled, they were numbered with the transgressors, and you take Jesus's sword command as being to make the disciples and Jesus look like bad guys, it conflicts with a theme throughout the entire Gospels, the four Gospels, and specific things that Jesus actually says about him looking guilty or not. Jesus goes through great lengths to make sure they have no legitimate accusations they can bring against him. Remember, they bring all these people before the Sanhedrin, before the courts, effectively. They're bringing them before the court to try to say, here's all the stuff Jesus did wrong. They can't get two witnesses to agree on any accusation. In this time, nobody brings the accusation that Jesus' disciples took swords and were basically attacking or ready to attack other people with them. Nobody even brings this up as an accusation because there was nothing illegal about them having just two swords amongst their group.
And I think that is a good assessment. That is true. I don't think he actually was trying to make the group appear as though they are rebels. But I also don't think Mike is correct in this instance either. And the reason why is because he's still focusing on this being about self-defense.
All that to say, this verse does not give you everybody can buy AK-47s, nor does it give you total pacifism. It seems as though it requires minimally arming yourself as a deterrent, maximally using self-defense whenever it's not God's will, as in the case of Jesus, for you to go ahead and face persecution and just accept it and honor the Lord in that.
Here's where we've been making a huge mistake. I actually believe that verse 36 has nothing to do with verse 37. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. In verse 36, Jesus is specifically saying to go out, buy a sword. They respond by saying, we already have some, and he goes, that's enough. I believe Peter inevitably ends up using one of these swords to cut off a man's ear. Whereas verse 37, if we actually look at what Jesus is quoting, he's quoting from Isaiah 53, there's more to this prophecy. Isaiah 53, verse 12. I will give him the honors of a victorious soldier because he exposed himself to death. He was counted among the rebels. He bore the sins of many and interceded for rebels. I don't think he's talking about the disciples at all. I think what he's talking about is being counted among the rebels who are crucified. And he bore the sins of many and interceded for rebels, interceding for Barabbas. So what Jesus is saying is the prophecy needs to be fulfilled. That prophecy being him interceding for Barabbas and being counted among the rebels when he is finally crucified. That is what this prophecy is about. It has nothing to do with the disciples whatsoever. I think that's the truth. I really do believe that that is the key here, because otherwise it becomes way too confusing. That makes sense. Everything immediately falls into place. And I'll tell you why. It's because when you look at verse 36, right, now it gives us an entirely different understanding. Eventually, when Peter uses the sword that's mentioned in verse 36 to cut off a man's ear, Jesus takes that opportunity to heal him. And then after Jesus heals him, he says, am I some dangerous revolutionary? Jesus is essentially saying, do I look dangerous? After healing a man's ear. He orchestrated this intentionally. He actually wasn't trying to make the disciples look like a rebellious group. What he was actually trying to do was show these people, even as they were trying to have him arrested, that he is an innocent man. And all of a sudden, all the pieces start to come together and everything makes a lot more sense. Because the truth is, it wouldn't make sense for Jesus to try to make the disciples look like a rebellious group. It makes so much more sense that the prophecy that we're talking about here in verse 37 is actually talking about Jesus being counted among the rebels who are crucified and interceding for rebels, Barabbas. That makes the most sense here. Now, if we suddenly have this new framework in mind, let's reread these verses and see if it still makes sense. Then Jesus asked them, when I sent you out to preach the good news, and you did not have money, a traveler's bag, or an extra pair of sandals, did you need anything? No, they replied. But now, he said, take your money and a traveler's bag, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. He's not telling them to buy a sword because he wants them to defend themselves. I don't think that's what he's doing. I believe Jesus is telling them to get a sword specifically because Jesus knows Peter's going to slash off a servant's ear, and Jesus wants to use that as an opportunity to prove to the people who are trying to have him arrested that even now I am an innocent man. Now, an appropriate question to ask, I think, at this point would be, well, if all that's true, why would Jesus even ask them to bring a sword if it's not about self-defense? Because Jesus could have easily had just not said anything, and all the sequence of events would still take place. But I don't think that's actually the case. I think we actually have to assume that Jesus actually wanted this to happen this way for a specific reason. And I think this is where things get very theoretical. I think the idea is, imagine that Jesus hadn't said it. Okay. Jesus starts to get arrested. Okay. Do all the disciples just stand around and let it happen? No, I think many of them would actually start fighting with their fists, and they would all try their best to essentially keep Jesus from being taken. And then eventually all of them would have probably ended up being arrested as a result, and I don't think Jesus wanted that. I think Jesus orchestrated this specifically to protect the disciples and to prove to the people trying to arrest him, I'm an innocent man, I'm going to show you. And he heals the man's ear. Then let's look at verse 37. For the time has come for this prophecy about me to be fulfilled. He was counted among the rebels. Yes, everything written about me by the prophets will come true. If Jesus is specifically talking about the crucifixion in this instance, then things all of a sudden become clearer. Because it means Jesus is not trying to make his disciples appear like they are rebels. The reason why I think this is the correct interpretation is because I think when people use Luke 22, verse 36, as a reason to justify buying some kind of weapon to defend yourself, the problem is it is dramatically inconsistent with everything that Jesus was teaching. And later on, in future books, when the apostles are being attacked for what they believe, they don't use swords to protect themselves. They don't go, let's protect ourselves with swords like Jesus instructed us to do. I think it's much more consistent if we actually view it this way. All of a sudden, I think so many things start to align and really make sense. I hope that I have spoken correctly. I think my biggest fear is that I'm going to mislead people with false information, and I never want to do that. I hope that if I ever do that, I can make sure that I inform people like, hey, I made a mistake here. Because ultimately, what this channel is about looking at things with a critical eye and being able to examine things correctly and with love and justice. I hopefully I have done this verse justice, and hopefully I've done God justice, and I am interpreting this correctly. But I sincerely hope that you're all doing well. Please take care of yourselves. Thank you so much for listening to my ramblings, and God bless you. Oh, and check out Mike Winger's video. Definitely check out his video because it's really good and he has a lot of great things to say. Thanks for watching.